Prince Henry, King of the United States? Let's talk about it. So, in 1786, the United States was having a lot of troubles under the Articles of Confederation. That was acknowledged by pretty much everyone. It would continue to be acknowledged, a year later when the Constitution was written, the following year to the ratification debates, even the people against the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists acknowledged there were some serious problems going on with the Articles of Confederation. There was not much getting done. Now, there were some issues that they didn't know how to resolve them. I want to remind you, at this point in time, most European nations, and therefore most of the commonly understood governments in the Western world, had kings. Most of them were constitutional monarchies of some nature, but there were kings and monarchs, and this is what the Americans were accustomed to. They had always had a king until a few years earlier. They only threw him off because he was being a real jerk about it. But the idea of having a king wasn't that far-fetched. And in fact, it had to be specifically written into the Constitution that there was no nobility. Additionally, many people were not super happy about the Society of the Cincinnatus that arose with officers of the Continental Army in the years after the American Revolutionary War ended, because many people looked at that as nobility. Some people weren't happy about it. Some people were members. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, they were members of what other people considered a royal society. So the idea of royalty wasn't unheard of like it is today. It was an option. And that's why it's not super surprising that in 1786, President of the Continental Congress, Nathaniel Gorham, wrote a letter through some mediaries to Prince Henry of Prussia. And this letter basically said, hey Henry, how would you feel about coming to North America and becoming king of the United States? I'm obviously paraphrasing. It was written in French, I believe. And it went through Baron von Steuben, through his friends in France, to his friends in Prussia. Von Steuben was from Prussia. And they felt him out. Now, this never comes to fruition. I'm going to skip ahead right now and say, not only does it not come to fruition, it looks like Prince Henry wrote a letter saying no thank you for various reasons, which we'll get to, but he never actually sent out the letter. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't sent. In fact, no one was sure this happened for about 100 years when the letter that Henry never sent was found, which actually validated this whole story in the early 1900s. Very surprising to find that letter. So, Nathaniel Gorham, he ends up writing the Constitution. He ends up being a very important member of the Constitutional Convention. He is a founding father. Don't get mad at him for this story, because I know how easy it is for us to look back and be like, he wanted someone to take over as king. That's not what was happening. The Continental Congress was desperate for a solution, and this was a solution. Now let's talk about why they contacted Prince Henry. Prince Henry's older brother was Frederick the Great. Yes, we want to keep that in mind, that Frederick the Great was running Prussia at the time that the American Constitution was written. In fact, Catherine the Great was running Russia at exactly this time also, just to put some context there. Frederick the Great is considered Frederick the Great because he started, for many reasons, but he's one of the early... He's not the one who brought Germany together and unified Germany, but he set the wheels in motion to eventually unify Germany. And many later leaders of Germany would look back at Frederick the Great as the Great, who set the ball in motion. He was also an astounding military leader, and although he certainly did some things that are not cool to his people, he did many things that were seen, especially at the time, as he was one of the liberal monarchs, as they were called. He was leading the way in creating certain freedoms. Again, it was moves he made that would later create the Germany that we know and love today. I know Germany went through some hard times there in the 20th century, but he went through the unification process. Many of the freedoms Germans enjoy today can be traced back to Frederick the Great. And the American revolutionaries saw this, and they respected the changes he was making. They saw him as a liberal monarch who believed in many of the ideas of freedom and democracy that they believed in. But again, he was a king, and being a king wasn't that crazy an idea. Additionally, Frederick the Great, when the Germans were sending Hessians from Hessian, the mercenaries, the Hessian and various other mercenaries from Germany were going to Great Britain to sail to America and fight against the Patriots. Frederick the Great did not allow those Germans to travel through Prussia to go fight the revolutionaries. And it was another thing that the Americans really, really respected about Frederick the Great. What does this have to do with Prince Henry? Well, Prince Henry was Frederick the Great's younger brother. So, if Frederick the Great's doing a pretty good job, why, Prince Henry seems to be doing what's to think he wouldn't do such a good job? So they write him this letter and they're like, hey, come be king, huh? And he ends up writing a letter that never comes back. And we're a little bit lucky he does, because it's within about 6 months that the Constitutional Convention is called together. A few months later, in 1787, the Constitutional Convention meets, which Nathaniel Gorham was a part of, and he was chairman of the Committee of the Whole, which means, as I've said before, Washington would step down for most of the day, and Nathaniel Gorham ran most of the show and was chairman of the Constitutional Convention for arguably about the same amount of time as George Washington. So again, don't be freaked out at Nathaniel Gorham. He signs the document. He's a very, 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 very important creator of the United States of America. He sends the letter, and since no response comes back and they call the Constitutional Convention, it kind of fades out, and we forget about it until about 1820, when Rufus King is running for president as the presidential candidate for the dying, if not already dead, Federalist Party. And he is sad for Rufus King. He gets a lot of grief for seemingly no reason. But Rufus King was running for president, and he was slandered because there was no way he was going to beat James Monroe. And they were just slandering him in public. And they were saying a lot of things that absolutely weren't true. And among these things that absolutely weren't true, they said something that was very, very true. And it was, hey, Rufus King participated with Nathaniel Gorham. He tried to make the king, Prince Henry of Prussia, king of the United States. And Rufus King was kind of like, no, no, that didn't happen. Because, people would lie all the time in the papers back then. Although I shouldn't say that. Rufus King didn't say much about it. It's hard to find an outright denial. He just kind of, ignores the question. And again, they couldn't prove it. And it wouldn't be until about 80 years after that someone even finds the letter and validates this story is even true. So he could pretty easily say, no, not a big deal, don't worry about it. But the story, again, it was so low-key at the time, despite the fact the president of the Continental Congress sending this letter to offer him to be a king, it was kept so quiet, people didn't really find out about it until 30 plus years later, almost 35 years later, when the public first found out about it, and it was another 80 years after that it was actually vindicated as a real story. So hope you enjoy that. I find it to be one of the most fascinating stories of the American Revolution. I presume you do too. Let's go.